The recording on. Hi. So I am, for those of you who don't know me, Jessica Maudlin Phelps, and I am the Associate for Sustainable Living and Earth Care Concerns with the Presbyterian Hunger Program. We're so excited to have you on the call today with us, and we'll be hearing from Wilson Dickinson, who is a writer, pastor, and organizer who lives in Georgetown, Kentucky. He teaches theology and directs the Doctor of Ministry and Continuing Education programs at Lexington Theological Seminary. He is the director of the Green Good News, which is an organization that works with churches and schools to integrate sustainability, justice, and discipleship. And he is the author of this book, which is the Green Good News, and we really loved this book, and so that's why we decided to invite him to present for us today. As he shares, if you have questions, please feel free to send them to us in the chat, or at the end of his presentation, there'll be times for you to ask that aloud as well. And so we're really looking forward to hearing from him, but also about the conversation at the end of the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, and thank you, Jessica. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm really grateful for the invitation. Grateful to Reverend Barnes, folks at the Presbyterian Hunger Program. Good to see Andrew King Bartlett on the call too, who I've met a couple times through Christian Food Movement stuff, and see some friends on here. But it's great to be here with you all, and I'm grateful for the time you all are taking to be here with me. I am a big believer that the smartest person in the room is always the room, but we only have an hour together, and so I'm going to do more talking than I am comfortable doing. But I do really want us to have time for conversation, so I'm going to give part of this presentation and then pause and then give the rest of it. And hopefully that will work. But what I want to do today is kind of give a snapshot of this book that Jessica mentioned, The Green Good News, and kind of also give a snapshot of it and then give a slice of it. And to the end of thinking about looking at the Gospels through the lens of environmental justice, and also thinking about our places in social change from our various geographies and kind of personal gifts. So first part, Green Good News in a nutshell. Now, I haven't done this before, but I want to focus on the parables today. So I have written up a little parable that I hope kind of expresses, I think this is Green Good News in a nutshell. So please bear with me through this little story. There once was a little girl who so loved God's good earth that she could not sleep after she became aware of the damage that was being done to it. One day she had an idea. Since I am small, I will try to get everyone to stop using a small thing, plastic straws. So she started a campaign on social media, and her idea went viral. Her small voice was amplified and shared. People started taking up her cause. Thousands and then hundreds of thousands pledged to stop using plastic straws. Petitions circulated. Entire cities passed ordinances to ban straws. Then one day, the little girl got an email from an executive of a plastics company. They set up a meeting. She worked on a presentation with her parents, and she dressed like a professional. But as soon as the meeting began, the executive was speaking and not listening. He told her, "You cannot stop this. This is bigger than me. This is bigger than you. This is bigger than all of us." He told her that even as an executive, he did not really make decisions, but that there were market pressures that demanded increased production and profits. There was something called the rebound effect, where gains in efficiency in one area are simply reinvested. He showed her charts on the use of plastic that gained exponentially in the face of policy changes that eliminated plastic bags and increased recycling. He concluded by saying, "You are working with a disorganized mass of individuals. I am serving a well-oiled machine that is organized top to bottom. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but you are wasting your time. You should be off doing what little girls do." The little girl left the meeting crestfallen. She knew he was right. We are disorganized, and it is organized. Then it struck her. The work was to change that. The work was to cultivate something rooted, connected, and growing. It would take time, perhaps longer than her life, but it was bigger than her, bigger than all of us. It would take others and would mean fostering something different and beautiful. And that was the good news. All right, so that's kind of what I want to say in a nutshell in parable form. But another way of saying that in a nutshell, and this is the thesis of the book, The Green Good News, is that the buried headline of the ecological crisis, right, and this is one of the theses of the Gospels, rendered in contemporary terms, that the only way is that the buried headline is that it's only by losing our isolated, overworked, and consumeristic lives that we may save our lives, right? Which is to say that in the face of all this terrible news about ecological crisis and systemic injustice, the response is actually good news. It's a simple and joyful life. And insofar as we fail to see both the systemic problem and the beautiful response, we tend to numb out and deny and avoid. And so this aspect of the Gospels and the way that the Gospels give us a path in the face of this contemporary terrible news, this comes clearer to me when I see the Gospels with the background of the Roman Empire, and then on the stage is the drama of liberation and covenant. Right. So to give you an example of this, what did Jesus say and do? Right, well, at his first sermon, he goes to his hometown synagogue. He gets up and he opens up the scroll from Isaiah. And what does he say he's going to do? Says, reads from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. Right? So the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed him. He's Christed him. That's what Christ means. Christ is the one who is anointed to do God's work, to bring about transformation. And that transformation is good news to the poor, right? It's economic and it's political. It's about addressing the empire. It's about addressing systems of oppression. As he says, he has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of the sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, right? Systems, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, right? Which is another way of talking about the Jubilee, which is the Jubilee is a mechanism and the covenant and the law that is about a redistribution of land, a redistribution of wealth, and of caring for the land in a certain way. Right. And so then the Gospels are the story of Jesus going about and doing this work. And then what happens to him? He's crucified. And in the ancient world, different crimes had different penalties. Blasphemers were stoned, citizens were beheaded, political insurrectionists and slaves were crucified. Right. And the manner of death of crucifixion was about making a sign, making a public statement that if you're going to go against the status quo, you will be killed. Right. So in the Gospels, the background is empire, the drama is liberation and renewal and radicalization of covenant. So to just kind of define some terms really quickly, since we don't have that much time, I understand empire as structures of exploitation and extraction. I understand covenant, and this for me has been transformative. And I guess I first saw this in the work of Walter Brueggemann and Ellen Davis, right? That covenant is not just right relationship between me and God, but it's right relationship between myself, my neighbor, and the land. And it's all those things all the time. And the only way to be in right relationship with God, neighbor, and land is to have right relationship with all, or to be cultivating that. And so then to connect this to our kind of contemporary problems, and we can talk about this more in our discussion time, but I take it as axiomatic that climate change is about empire, right? That climate change comes from, the sources of climate change are increases in greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, et cetera, but that those carbon emissions come from structures of exploitation and extraction. Right. So if the problem is actually this deeper systemic issue, then the response to climate change is system change. And so I mean, one way of framing the issue in this way, I think, is about approaching this with the kind of wisdom and insights of what are often called environmental justice traditions or the environmental justice movement. And I think that is a bit different in its orientation and emphasis with what's often thought of as mainstream environmentalism in our kind of American context. And this is kind of drawn in terms of a cartoon contrast. You know, there aren't two incredibly distinct traditions, but just to kind of give you a sense of where I'm coming from, I think from the environmental justice approach, when we say the environment, we mean that place where we work, live, and play. Right? The environment isn't out there. The environment are the habitats in which we live. Right? And so the response to the destruction of the places where we work, live, and play, and all those places where that our habitats are dependent upon, is to share and to cultivate and to transform. Right? And you do that by transforming and challenging and creating alternative political and economic structures, right? And political economic structures as they exist are taken to be not as given, but as unjust and in need of repair. Right, and so I think there are some tendencies in mainstream or what might be called white environmentalism to think of the environment as nature. So it's something that's out there, it's something that's beyond humans by definition. And so then the response is to conserve and preserve or to manage. And then political and economic structures are often taken as given and natural. Right? So the work is not to change the structure, is to work within it to kind of manage and conserve. Right? So I think that if we make this shift, both to see the empire in the background of Jesus and to these environmental justice concerns, I think that we begin to see the ways that the Gospels connect up with addressing these problems of the ecological crisis and contemporary injustice. Right? So then the response, the way that we get to system change from the environmental justice perspective is growing the grassroots. Right? And so there's this old saying in community organizing that you cannot mobilize before you organize. Right? So if you want to change structures of power and you want to put pressure on people who are in power, and you want people to show up to the Capitol building, you can't get people there unless they've already been organized, right? Unless you've already brought people together, learned what matters to them, empowered them, created networks, et cetera. But I think that there's another step that's also missing, which it's often missed, is you can't do grassroots organizing if the grass have no roots. So I'm saying all this is, so if the issue is system change, how do we get the system change? We grow the grassroots. We use grassroots power, and how do we get that? Well, that means that a lot of the work is about building community. Right? If we don't have loving and just and joyful communities, then we won't even be able to organize people to put pressure. But community is also not just the means, it's also the end. Right? The whole reason we would want to change systems is so that people can be living in loving and joyful ways. And so the work in a lot of ways is this work of growing the grassroots. And so then I think that this means seeing power in places where our culture does not. And so whereas I think a lot of environmentalism focuses on issues of consumption, if we want to change systems, we need to not just look at consumption, but we also need to look at areas of production and exchange and accumulation. But I think the real place that especially people of faith have to contribute is this area that's called by feminists a lot of times social reproduction. Right? So if the economic system we often think of is the space like the factory in this picture over here that produces things, just to have people show up into the factory to make things, they need a whole world that nurtures them, that cares for them, that educates them, right? And so that whole world, which is by the logic of economics called an externality, right? And the accounting of kind of contemporary corporate world, all this stuff like the environment is an externality, and the people that care for the people who work is an externality, right? It's not included in the equation. But there's this whole world that's called of social reproduction, this world of care that modes of empire do not see. And so if we want to bring about systemic change, then I think that people of faith should set up our shop in this space, right? This is where churches are, and this is where home, and in this space of churches and homes and friendships and education, caring for kids and sick and elders, neighborhoods, civic organizations, arts and culture. I think that there's a power hiding in plain sight here. And so then to tie this back again, I'm trying to give a whole lot of stuff in a nutshell. Well, I'll come back to this. And so then to tie this back together, I think this is actually how Jesus proceeded, right? He set up shop in those spaces. He did some public demonstration, but he also set up shop in the margins, and he did work to kind of unveil the violence of empire to point toward an alternative vision. But also he organized communities through meals and feedings and healings and alternative economies and households. And so then the vision of system change then is to intervene at the level of ways of life and to use that to transform structures of power. Okay. So that's the green good news in a nutshell, which is to say it's only by losing our isolated, overworked, consumeristic ways of life that we can save them. And so the way we do that is through covenantal renewal and radicalization, right? Because Jesus didn't have, we don't see in the Gospels a blueprint. What we get in the Gospels are social practices. And these are social practices that do things that intervene in the space of community to build up a different kind of community that can then change the empire and change ways of life and systems. Okay, so that was everything a little bit rushed, but this is the first part of the presentation where I'm kind of giving this to you in a nutshell. I wanted to have a break now just for questions or comments before I go into the next part of the presentation, which will be about parables and finding our place in social change. So I want to open up the floor if there are questions or comments. I also understand if people are ready to go.
I just love this so much. I mean, I've talked with you a little bit. I just have loved this book. Some of you may have seen the review I've done on it. I think we're all struggling with where do we start and how do we start, but I think talking about how you build power by things that we love and enjoy, and that the things that we're drawn to and make us healthy are the things that can build community, and by building community you build power, and then that's what can do that systemic change. I think it frees us up from what feels so heavy sometimes with public policy advocacy and so forth, but it's that community emphasis. And it just occurred to me on your last slide, I was thinking, prayer is something that's not yet been commercialized, or at least in our tradition, in our time, we don't, pay for prayers. But it is something that tracks. I care about you. I care about your child or your mother or your cat or, what's going on around the world. And it's a way that we build community and build power and relationships. So not that prayer should ever be separated from action, but that is a piece of family and church and spaces that can start to build that alternate reality. So anyway, just love this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, I agree about prayer entirely. And I'm rereading Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited right now, and it's striking me again. And so Thurman writes this book, I guess, in 1949, and it's about kind of Jesus from the perspective of people who are oppressed or have their backs against the wall, as he always says. But the book is deeply concerned both with justice and with the quality of our spiritual lives. And he does not see those things as opposed at all. And there's been times in my life when I've read that book and put it down because I thought it was too spiritual. But I think that he's entirely right. I mean, and I guess I'm seeing that especially now as I'm getting on, to how many stages of burnout have I gone through with activism, right? And yeah. So I echo the prayer. So
Can you say the name of the book again, please?
Oh, yeah, actually, I have it on my desk. It's Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. Any other questions or comments, accusations? Okay, I'm happy to move forward. Or, you can also interrupt me. It's not an interruption, it's a conversation.
And if folks have questions, like I would just remind you again, you can also put those in the chat as we go, as he's sharing. So.
All right, so I'll get back to, there we go. So again, what I want to talk about now is about the parables, right? So there's a chapter in the book, Bring Good News, on parables. And there's a great literature out there that's kind of come out in recent years on the parables. And one of the biblical scholars that I really draw on in the chapter, and that was really eye-opening for me. Actually, the whole project came together because someone on this call named Pat Clark handed me Herzog's book on the parables. And I read it, and it connected so many things I had been working on with my teaching and ministry and organizing. Very grateful for that. But so Herzog has this wonderful line where he says that, we tend to read the parables as earthly stories with a heavenly meaning, right? So we take them as these stories that have this kind of veneer of earth, but it's really about kind of some kind of deeper otherworldly meaning. But he says that the parables are earthy stories with a heavy meaning, right? Which is, and he wants to call Jesus a liberative pedagogue. Right? So he wants to say the stories are embedded in everyday life, and they're about helping us see the world in a different way. Right? And so there is this really interesting thing that once you start looking at the parables in a different way, you see the patterns of how you have been reading the parables or heard other people read them. And, it could be that maybe since, living under centuries of patriarchy, this makes sense, but there's this weird tendency to read a story where there's a powerful man and then everybody's like, okay, that's God. Even if the powerful man is terrible, like even in the terms of the story, but that's been the kind of dominant way of reading the parables, right? So there's a slaveholder, there's a cruel king, that's God. and I wonder though, what is the psychic impact of having those stories kind of reinforce each other over the years? But anyway, another way of reading the parables, and one that I actually, Herzog's book, he wants to say this is closer to the historical Jesus. There's another book by Louis Schocherhoff, a German scholar, and she even says this is what the Gospels are about. But anyway, another way of looking at the parables is to say that they are more like our political cartoons. Right? A lot of what they're doing is that they're unveiling unjust political orders. And so what they do is they teach with these thick and kind of gritty aspects of everyday life, and they're not and they bring everyday life to the fore, not so we can see through them to some deeper spiritual meaning, but they're thick aspects of everyday life, so we can begin to see the way that power and domination and oppression and also liberation hide in plain sight in our normal interactions. And so the function of the Gospels then is to pull back the good news of the empire, right? Because the dominant forces around us are always saying, we're the job creators, we're the source of virtue, you all are lazy. It's to pull that back and to instead shine the light of the good news of Christ, of Kingdom of God, of cooperative commonwealth. So to illustrate this, I want to read just one kind of longer parable to you all, one whose alternative reading I especially detest. But this one is the parable of the talents. So it begins, or Jesus begins in Matthew 25, to say, for it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, and for his peasant hearers, this would have been like Jesus saying, to one he gave $5 gajillion, right? It's just an amount of money they can't really comprehend. To another he gave 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. Then the slaveholder went away. The slave who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. But the slave who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the slave master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the slave who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you have handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. And so for hearers of this story, just to give an aside or an explanation, there would have been something clear that in making this kind of money this quickly, something is afoot, something is amiss. And one of the ways that you make money in the ancient world, especially in 1st century Judea and Galilee, is that you seize land, right? So you do you go through this process of predatory lending, where you find people who own like a family farm who are in debt, and you give them a loan, but you require the collateral of the family farm to get the money, and then because they're in debt, they're already in this kind of precarious position, and then oftentimes you get money. You get land, and land is the real source of respectable, lasting wealth in the ancient world. The great Roman senator Cicero has this list of of positions from like best to lowest. The best are in his mind, right? The senator of empire is the landholder, and the lowest, not coincidentally for other stories of Jesus, is fisherman. But anyway, the way that you get money is that you do predatory. The way that this slave would get this money is to do predatory lending, to seize other people's land. So his master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master," which is to say, come to my banquet table. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, "Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours." But his master replied, "You are a wicked and lazy slave. You knew that that I did not reap where I did not sow, and I gather where I did not scatter. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers. On my return, I would have received what was my own with interest," right? So the master is not contradicting the negative things that the slave has said about him. He's actually affirming them, right? So he goes on to say, "So take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10 talents. For to all those who have more, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him out into the darkness, where he will be weeping and gnashing his teeth." So we have here then at the bottom, there's this kind of like, here's the values of the master. And oftentimes this, if we read God as the slaveholder, then this is the values of God, right? And this is taken as an example of some kind of prosperity gospel. But I think the way that this parable is functioning for Jesus is it's unveiling the cruelty of the order, right? So instead of saying, well, we should be thankful for the jobs that we have and for the job creators that give them to us, or instead of saying, the successful people, they work hard and they have the good ideas, that's why they have the money, he's saying, no, the way that people make money is through exploitation and extraction. And this is a story that tells people that. And there's all kinds of stories like this. But if you're feeling skeptical at this moment, I want to remind you that this is Matthew 25, right? So directly following this story, right, that ends with judgment, where the slave is thrown out in darkness and gnashing of teeth, where we're given the empire's vision of what goodness is, right? We have the famous Matthew 25, right? Where the mythic vision, the parable of the sheep and the goats, right? So in contrast to the empire, we have the kingdom of God, where Christ comes, the Son of Man comes, the human one comes, and does a different kind of judgment. And what's the criteria for being in the joy of Christ? Right? It's when you served Christ by serving the least of these. It's when you gave the thirsty something to drink, when you gave the hungry something to eat. It's when you gave the naked clothes, you welcomed the stranger. And so Matthew 25, right, we could not have it clearer. The parable of the talents, which is showing the cruelty of the empire, set up in contrast with the way of Christ's kingdom, the cooperative commonwealth. And so a lot of what I think a lot of what I think that the parables are doing is they're setting up this contrast between empire and covenantal ways of life. And so a lot of the parables are actually about the cruel ways of empire. And so, you see this story that goes on in the parable of the talents, right, where the way that they get money was from doing predatory lending and seizing land. A lot of the parables are telling that story, right? And this story is taking place in first century Judea and Galilee, where all kinds of people are losing land. And they're losing land because they're going into debt, because there's also this extracted tax system, right? In the ancient world, there's no pretense that taxes are a pool of resources for the common good. It's because the emperor supposedly owns all the land. You have to give your share to the emperor and to the wealthy. And so the taxes are extractive method. And if you're a subsistence farmer and you are having to pay taxes every year, it means that one bad growing season, you have to pay taxes, you have to feed your family. It's easy to go in debt. Once you go into debt, it's very hard to get out of debt. And that leads to this process where your land is foreclosed. And so instead of living on a farm, you are now a tenant farmer, which now means that you are growing food for someone else's profit. That's a difficult situation to be in. Usually doesn't last that long. And then oftentimes people fall out of being a tenant farmer, or fell out of being a tenant farmer into becoming a day laborer, which was an incredibly precarious situation to be in the ancient world. People who became day laborers usually had a life expectancy, they estimate, of about 5 to 7 years after that. And then you could only really make day laboring last so long because you're getting paid so little and everything's so contingent. You often fall into destitution, which means that your options are to be a bandit or a beggar, right? And so, and these are the characters of the parables, right? Tenants, day laborers, bandits, beggars. This is what Jesus is talking about. And he's talking about this because he's interested in contrasting the ways of the empire with its extractive economy and the covenantal life of village life, which is built on these profoundly deep social ties where people take care of each other, right? Where they share. So that there's the rule of the village and of the covenant is all about sufficiency and sharing and commonwealth. And it's also, and so there are all these social injustice aspects to it, but it's also, again, the covenant is always about the relationship between God, neighbor, and land. These different economies have profound consequences for how the land is treated. So the extractive methods of empire, lead to all kinds of agricultural practices like our contemporary monoculture that destroy the land. And there's all kinds of archaeological evidence about just the ecological devastation that the Roman Empire wrought and that empires in general do. In contrast, you have these sustainable kind of peasant agrarian communities that are living by a different logic. Jesus is highlighting that Jewish tradition and he's radicalizing it. And so another thing that the parables do is that they give us a glimpse at this other kind of kingdom. Okay, I'm being a little more long-winded than I mean to, I'm sorry. I'm gonna try and pick up the pace a little bit. Even though I know I'm already plowing through a lot of material. But so another thing that the parables do is they tell these positive stories of what the kingdom looks like. So one short one is that the kingdom of heaven, this is Matthew, so he's saying kingdom of heaven, is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until it was leavened. Right. So what is the kingdom of God like? Well, if you want to look for an agent of the kingdom of God, look toward a woman, right? Doing that work of social reproduction, right? So we have a figure who is not typically looked at as a figure of power, doing something in a place that is often denigrated and looked down upon. But Jesus wants to say, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's like a woman, and she takes 3 measures of flour, which is more flour than, she's making more bread than one family needs, right? She's making bread for multiple families. And then she's taking the fruit of the land, and she's taking yeast, and she's collaborating with creation, right? So we have a creature collaborating with other creatures, with the fruit of creation, living into the rhythms and ways of the creator to share. This is the way of the cooperative commonwealth. Right? So Jesus tells these little peasant stories about, you all know how this covenantal life looks, and these are the agents who have power. This is who we should be looking toward. So in another one of these kind of agrarian, nice short pithy parables is the parable of the growing seed, where Jesus says the kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise at night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. So it's this beautiful process of the creature cultivating, nurturing creation, but also the mystery and the bounty and the goodness of creation. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle, because the harvest has come. So the kingdom of God looks like this cooperation and the beautiful, mysterious bounty that comes from creation. And the kingdom of God looks like the harvest time, where work and collaboration show us the joy and the sustenance of earth. But there's also, of course, there are layers to these parables, right? So there's a layer I didn't deal with the unleavened part up in the parable of the yeast. There's a layer here in the parable of the growing seed that's about, the harvest is oftentimes taken as a metaphor for the judgment time that's coming, right? So for these apocalyptic images, like the apocalyptic image of Matthew 25, of the goats being separated from the sheep. But if you are someone who loves and wants to live into the ways of covenant and simplicity and sharing, then the harvest or judgment is good news, right? But if you are someone who wants the empire to go on for eternity, that's scary. So Jesus is telling these little stories from everyday life to help us see the cruelty of the unjust common order, but then to also begin to see alternatives. Because I'm talking too long, I'm going to skip another parable that says kingdom of God is like. So the last little piece that I want to kind of talk about before we open up the floor is about finding our place in social change. So I've written another silly little parable to help us to kind of encapsulate this last section. There once was a man who felt as though he was being crushed by the weight of a system. He was certain that there was no action that he could take that was big enough to move the powers and principalities that were consuming him and the whole earth. He would spend his days sweating and to try and lift it up over his head. But then a breeze graced his brow. It was the air of a spirit moving through peoples and communities. It whispered in his ear, "Find your place in my movement. There is a path marked by the one called Christ. Yet you cannot follow it as the Christ, but as a member of a body, a gathering, a community. Let yourself be moved into a place that honors you and that will allow you to love it. Give your life to this moment, to this movement of justice and joy, and it will save your life." So a lot of what I want to say in this kind of closing section is about trying to begin to think about how we can find our part in the just massive, overwhelming work of system change. Because one of the things about seeing these connections with issues of empire in the Gospels in our own times is to begin to see a larger time scale, where we see that cycles of extraction and exploitation are just centuries old, and they're global in scale, and they're just not going to change in an election cycle. But I think that seeing that, I think we still need to hold on to what I want to call prophetic patience, right? So I think pragmatic incrementalism often sees something big, and it wants to work within the system with the values of the system. And I think that in some ways we do have to do that, and I'll get to that. But I think prophetic patience wants to work on a long time scale. It sees that hope takes place on the level of generations. But it does not, but it's looking to build movements that will bring about profound change. But one of the hard things with anything that involves patience is if you're somebody who cares about climate change, there's a profound sense of urgency. So one of the things that helps me think about holding these things in tension is to think about 3 timelines of action. Right? So I think in the next decade, right, we're told that in the next decade, we have to do absolutely as much as we can. Right? Immediate mitigation is absolutely important. And so the work of advocacy and mobilizing and working within systems that needs to be something that's animating our action. And so maybe the metaphor, or actually the very literal work here, is saving every tree that we can. But because the problem is systemic, we also need to be doing actions that will take longer to develop. And so in the next several decades, I think we need to be building a movement for the Great Transition, right? So which is to say growing alternative grassroots networks and deep solidarity and social connections and real visions. Right? And so the kind of proverbial and literal work of that is planting trees today. Right? We don't just need to save the trees, we need to be planting trees, and as the saying goes, the second best time to plant a tree is today. But I also think our work needs to be taking place on another timeline, and that's the next century. Right? And that's working for a restored and beautiful life, and that's changing systems. And to borrow the image then from Wendell Berry, this work is farming sequoias. Right? This is planting work that the fruit of which we won't get to see in our lives, maybe, probably. I mean, sometimes things change faster than we're expecting them. So these timelines, we don't have to think of them as entirely solid, but thinking of things like on these multiple timelines, I think is helpful for me to think about where my work fits in and where my different work fits in, and where my work with different communities fits in. And so related to that, because our kind of hyper-individualized context often makes us think that we need to be doing all the work all the time by ourselves, I think it's helpful to think about, well, what if a lot of our work is building a movement? And that movement then is, by definition, it's a bunch of people, and it doesn't have to be a movement that is of lowest common denominator, but it's higher common purpose. And so it's building across different movements, it's building across communities, it's building over time. And so when thinking of coalition building, it's helpful for me to think about different levels in which that coalition is being grown. And so my bias is I think that the heart of this work is cultivating local communities. And I guess to be clear, I think it makes sense if you're someone who's really committed to this stuff to think about where your feet are, like where are your 2 feet? And my bias is I think everybody needs a foot in this heart, and then maybe a foot somewhere else. But I think that to sustain the work of going against the system, you need a local community, or you need a community. You need a community that's trying to live out in integrity the difference, that's trying to incarnate that difference. Now, because you're swimming against stream against something that's massive, those communities are not going to be perfect. They're going to be extremely flawed. And even the small thing that they're probably trying to live in integrity with is going to be difficult. But I think that there's so much, you need that local community to be sustained by, and you need to learn from it, because it's in that kind of practical incarnational space that a lot of things really start to become clear. both shortcomings and like kind of openings. So that's the center. Again, sorry, I'm talking too long. Next ring out is building networks among the committed. Right? I think that this is connecting a lot of these local groups. The next ring out, I think, is working with established communities and institutions that have some kind of resonance or value that's there, but maybe aren't quite there yet. This is the, the growing edge of this of really building the movement, but it's long, hard work. And that's another reason why I think you need to be rooted in something else, because yeah, there's so many structures set up to go in a different direction. I think the most peripheral work is a work that often some liberal traditions focus us on at the beginning, but I think it's actually probably more peripheral, which is working with antagonistic groups. Now, we are the tradition of Paul. We are the tradition of conversion, right? And so we have to be open to that. And I think that there is a value, and even if you're working with groups who are antagonistic to justice and sustainability, there's a real value in just pacifying people who have become militarized. But I think that if we're talking about the work of movement building, I think we really need to think about how to grow that movement and how to bring together the people who are committed and try and get them on the same page so that we can build things to invite people into, right? Paul was not invited into the Christian movement as a persecutor, right? He was invited in as transformed. And so to give some examples of what this might look like, for me, this inner ring has been exemplified for me in some examples from the Christian food movement. So I'm involved with a dinner church. I live in a multifamily household. I'm related to or married to all the people here, one of the two. I'm married to one of the people here. I'm related to the other people here, just to make that clear. I'm in Kentucky. But I'm in a multifamily household that is committed to living sustainably, right? Part of Dinner Church. These kinds of communities are things that sustain me and that I also learn from in their shortcomings and in their gifts. Another ring out, I think, is something like the Presbyterian Hunger Ministry, Creation Justice Ministries, where you're building those networks, right? And so part of that network building is upward focused, right? Of that more immediate work of mobilizing advocacy. I think a lot of that work, though, is also grassroots focused, where these network buildings, what you do is you want to support and radicalize those communities of integrity, and resource and radicalize and support those established institutions, and also bring together communities of practice of all these people who are doing all this stuff and figure out how to do it better in different contexts. And so in the third ring, that's right. So that's like the work of transforming churches, but not transforming churches for efficient operations, but to become covenantal communities. Okay. So then that is me talking really fast and still going too long about the Green Good News, trying to give you all kind of that in a nutshell and then a slice of it. If you are interested in the book, from now until Saturday, my publisher is offering it at a discount, 40%. Here, that the Ways of the Empire is coming in. Now I'm hawking a book, but all you have to do is enter in the promo code Green Good. And also, a lot of the stuff I say about social change, I've said an even more long-winded way of saying that in a series of online presentations I have on my website, and I'll put both of those things in the chat in case people are interested. But now I promise I will stop talking and I will open it up to conversation, right? There can be questions to me, but also, this is a space of people who are dedicated. So you all can talk to each other too.
Thank you so much for what you have shared with us. Are there questions that folks have? If you would like to just unmute yourself and pose those, we have time for a couple of questions or comments.
Here's something that I kept thinking about while you were talking, Wilson, and that's sometimes this is a hard sell to different people. And it felt like adding another layer of hard sell, and that's teamwork, and that's the common good. And the one word that people will say is, well, that's socialism. Do you have any success stories of just not being knocked down by that criticism?
I might try and avoid the success stories thing. No, so to the first part about teamwork being hard, I think that's entirely right. But I'm involved with a community garden, and I'm not a good gardener. Community is so much harder than gardening because it's so countercultural. And after 40 years of the erosion of all forms of community, I mean, there's been all kinds of other cultural forces, but there's really been a tremendous assault on all forms of social infrastructure and community over the last 40 years, like a very intentional assault from the corporate sector. So I think that my answer would be that maybe the starting point is not selling to people who don't want to hear it. I think that's important work, and I think the question is, I think that's important work that should be done by people who are in a certain social location and have certain gifts. I think some of the other work is building that community to invite people into, and that might be small and slow at first, but I think that's what sustains. Right? So I think that the work is not to change minds, it's to change our shared lives. Because if we're constantly just looking at trying to change minds and having conversations, that's ephemeral and can get lost. What we need are things that are planted in social practices that are self-replicating and that are nurturing and that grow. But then that comes to a hard question of figuring out in your place with the people you know and love, or at least know, who could you maybe work with and on what? And that's slow and hard. I mean, my success stories are all small things. And I've actually, I live in a very, very red context. I live in a very conservative place. Which is Kentucky, but even the county I live in, like our representatives, are the ones who do the most insane things, like in our state legislature, even if, one of them was my Sunday school teacher. But I understand the hostile context, but I do think that you begin small. One of the things I've done, though, living in a very hostile context, is I've also turned a lot of energy to building networks. So like that second ring, a lot of my work has now been focused on doing that. Though, I do want to play the long game in the place that I am. I think you're muted, Tom. Were you? Oh.
Thank you, Dennis, for the comment that you shared about and you mentioned the recording going forward. And I just wanted to say, for those of you who entered your email address when you registered to participate on this, we'll be sending you the link to the recording, and we'll also be sharing it on the Eco Journey Facebook page as soon as we have that available. It looks like, Andrew, you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
I do. Despite Wilson's reluctance to keep talking, I want to keep him talking. So I have a question about the role or the place of racial justice and racial healing within this building of community that you've talked about. I guess I've come to the conclusion that that is core to our work as Christians and as people if we're going to make progress on these bigger systemic issues, or just prefiguring, the kind of community that we want. So I would love to hear any reflections on that.
Yeah, so two things. One thing is I often think, so for starting points too, or even just thinking about how to grow this stuff, especially as a white person, and as a white middle class overeducated person. It seems like that you start this stuff, you start with the margins in two senses, right? So you start with the margins because, and by that I mean, you find ways to enter into solidarity and to learn from communities that have been oppressed, right? And part of that is about justice, right? These environmental issues are going to affect the communities who have been oppressed by empire for centuries, right? They're gonna affect them even more. And so the issues of environmental, of kind of ecological catastrophe are issues of racial justice. Right? These things are completely intertwined. And I'm kind of the mind that the kind of world system that we have right now, it's not just that we have this kind of broken world system and racism was layered on top. It's that these things co-arose, and they arose together, and they're just inextricably intertwined. And so a lot of what we need to do is to like center the voices of these oppressed communities, in part because they know how to live and resist. They know how to live in empire and resist it. And there's all these traditions of wisdom. Also, they need to be centered because they are facing the brunt of it and will face it even more. Yeah, so I think you start with the margins in that way. But then also I think in another way you start with the margins, as in, I think you start with the margin of your life. Right. So, and I think for a lot of us, that margin feels very small. So margin as in like extra, like, so the extra time we have, the extra money we have, because the empire is cruel. And there aren't a lot of options between living pretty good and then just being left to the wolves. Right. And so, I mean, I want to acknowledge that we live in a kind of a dangerous time, but I think you start with the margins. And then you see like those margins in your life, and you try and reimagine those. And I think the more that you live into both of those senses of the margins, the more margin you're going to see you actually have. Right? So something like that I did in my life is my wife and I, who still live a very comfortable life. Well, I don't have to get into that. We don't have to get into my guilt. But we sold a house we sold our house. And sold one of our cars, and we moved into a house with my mom and my sister and my nephew, as I mentioned earlier. And so creating that space, right, doing something with that margin has opened up a lot of time for us to be involved in other things. That's not an example that works for almost anyone, but that's just an example of maybe trying to play with the margin of your life to see how to do something different, and also to learn from people from marginalized groups. I also think, and sorry to talk so much, but I also think that if empire and kind of ecological destruction and racism are all intertwined, part of my work as a white person is to begin the process of disentangling myself from whiteness. I think that structures of whiteness are about structures of dislocation and disassociation. There's a long story to be told here, but the short version is what part of what the construct of race and whiteness does is it distances us from the land, and it distances us from our different networks of relationship. And so part of the work of disentangling ourselves from whiteness is to place make, right? To connect back to our places. That's both beautiful and painful if we're honest about what our places are. And it's also about reassociating, which is to say, as a white person, beginning to understand who my ancestors are, what my heritage is, and what that means, beautiful and terrifying. Right? And so I think this work is in racial justice is all completely intertwined. Where do you see openings for that, Andrew, or do we have time and I'm keeping people over? I'm sorry.
Well, we are over our time a little bit, so I want to make sure that folks know that if you do need to go, please do so without guilt about that. And also, I just maybe another time we could schedule a follow-up webinar where you talk a little more about dislocation and disassociation, because I think there's a lot more to be said there that we would be interested in hearing. Andrew, did you have any quick final comments that you'd like to share in response to that?
They would not be quick, so if there's time, I'll open it up to other questions or comments from others.
Well, we are at time, so I do want to honor everyone's time and let you go, but we have loved so much what you have shared. I think we will be chewing on it for quite a bit, and I would love to schedule a follow-up presentation if you would be open to that, so we can talk more about that offline.
Absolutely, and thanks everybody. I mean, thanks you all for the invitation to be here, and thank you everybody who came. And you know, I'll put my email in the chat, or please let me know if I can be of help.